The stories. Dispatcher, who kept the secret from a bridge call, the call began with the sound that never leaves him, a river hush that sat under a thin voice. On the log, it read as a welfare check near the west span. The timestamp matched the shift change. The tower camera sent a smeared view of headlights, and the wind pushed rain and slanted ropes across steel. He wrote the first line in block letters. Male caller. Alone? No traffic lane blocked. Unknown age, unknown intent. In training, they, from the start, had said the first 10 seconds decide the rest. He believed that for years. He had a plain goal that night. Finish paperwork early, drink the cold coffee anyway, and get home before midnight. Kellen Duarte, age 38, worked as an emergency dispatcher in a river town that never liked headlines. He lived quiet. 2 rooms over a grocery where the owner knew his name and saved him bruised peaches. He was good at the slow voice and the clear questions. He kept a notebook with dates and little arrows. On the tape, his opening line sounded the same as always. County Communications, tell me what is happening. The caller coughed, then said he was at the railing near the center truss. He asked for no sirens. Kellen clicked a marker on the map and moved the cursor a hair so the unit tags would not overlap. He asked for a name, and the caller hesitated like he was picking one from a shelf he had not visited. Call me Ross, the man said, then added something about the water looking like foil if you did not blink. There was a push of air like a mic against a jacket, and the traffic under the bridge hummed steady. Kellen kept the tone even, told Ross that people could meet him where he stood, and asked what brought him there. Someone I loved died on this bridge, Ross said. And his voice steadied, like he had waited to finally say it. In his log, Kellen wrote the words that mattered. Loss stated. Prior connection to scene. No weapons reported. Calm speech. From the other console, Nira scrolled road closures and passed him a sticky note that read, Northbound lane is clear. He muted the room feed for a second, so the printer squeal would not land in Ross's ear and spook him. He asked the year of the loss, and Ross said it fast, like it tasted bad. 2014. Kellen repeated the year and let the silence work while he dispatched a patrol car and a medic unit in the background. He knew the story people told about that year. A sedan climbed the curb during a storm and hit a contractor. The papers had run one photo of cones and a dropped hard hat. No names followed, just an archived blurb and rain. From the tower camera, a freight train horn carried along the riverbank, then faded as the unit names flashed en route. Kellen asked if Ross knew the person who died by name. Ross said he knew the face and the last words. A small thing changed in Kellen then. A sound from the record shelf in his mind fell flat and stayed there. He once took a midnight call from a work crew foreman near the same span. He kept that tape in memory. Ross said the last words were not for him. They were for a dispatcher who told the crew to hold 10 minutes. Kellen tapped the headset cushion, careful to keep the room quiet, and asked where Ross had heard those words. Ross said he had heard them from a phone found in a cracked case under the North Pier after the storm. He said the phone worked for one day after the rain stopped, and that he had played the last message recorded. He said the message was from County Communications with a different voice, and it told the crew to stay clear. Kellen felt the old shift wash through him. The storm year had ended in a tangle of rumors and a closed memo. He had read that memo while filing tired overtime sheets. He filed it without speaking and chose to keep moving. On the camera, one pair of headlights slowed near the shoulder as if a driver could sense the weight of the rail. Kellen radioed the nearest cruiser to stage 2 blocks off with lights off, and he asked Nira to notify the medic quietly. He asked Ross to tell him who the contractor was, and Ross said the name with a short stop between first and last. The name matched the contractor mentioned in the closed memo, except the memo had spelled the name without an accent mark. Kellen wrote the name as Ross said it, exact and careful, then underlined it once for the transcription that would follow. He asked Ross why he came now and not earlier, and Ross said an anniversary sits on the mind like a stone. He also said that the memo never named the dispatcher who told the crew to hold, which was why he had called. Kellen understood the shape of that ask, even if the words around it were soft. He was not supposed to name staff. The policy existed for safety and sanity, and it covered nights when grief needs a door and someone tries that door. He told Ross he could share what the record allows, and he asked if hearing the process might help him stand. Ross said hearing the process might help, though he refused the idea of sirens again and asked for plain truth instead. Kellen kept his sentence length slow and warm. He said that storm calls can trigger staggered staging for worker safety. He said if there were downed lines or compromised joints, a hold might be given while a state engineer was patched in. He also said that every such hold carried timestamps, and that those stamps were kept by policy for 7 years. Ross breathed in and asked what happens when 7 years have passed, and Kellen answered before he could think of softness. He said the system cycles recordings to deep archives after 7 years, and some are erased when retention windows expire. Ross said he had a copy in case the archive could not confirm. Then he claimed the voice on the tape named a company. He said the tape used a phrase that a dispatcher would not use unless someone off-channel asked for a careful delay. Kellen had heard that phrase once. It was the night a junior engineer requested a slow approach while a supervisor closed a lane. The phrase was not suspicious by itself, and yet, in memory, it wore the shape of a request he never liked. He asked Ross to read the phrase, and Ross said it. Hold 10 for a clear handoff if site control is missing. Neera glanced over with a look that said, "Do not get pulled into the river." Kellen nodded and kept the pace steady. He told Ross he could not speak to motives of old voices, and he could not name a colleague or contractor from memory. He said he could meet Ross with a sergeant who knew the policy, and they could file a supplemental report for records. Ross said he was tired of reports. Then he asked a new question. Was someone paid to push that hold in the storm? Kellen chose his words like glass marbles placed in a line. He said he had not seen evidence that proved a bribe. He said he had seen maintenance slips that missed dates in years with bad weather, and he had seen budgets cut twice. He said contracts sometimes shifted mid-season, and miscommunication could look like intent when viewed through grief and time. The cruiser staged in the dark lot of a bait shop, and the medic idled near a closed diner with frosted windows. The tower camera picked up 2 figures near the midspan, and the wind made their jackets move like wet flags. Kellen asked Ross if someone stood with him, and Ross said a cyclist had stopped and was holding a flashing light. He asked the cyclist for the phone, and the cyclist, shouting through wind, said he would hold the light where Ross stood. Kellen brought the cruiser onto the bridge, slow and quiet, then asked Ross to look over his right shoulder for headlights. He said he would keep talking while the car approached, and he would ask simple things about the person lost. Ross began to tell a short life. He said she had a laugh that came in bursts, and she liked folded maps. He said she had taken a night shift to help a younger sister, and she kept a lanyard with a faded tag. He said he watched her set cones before the storm hit, and he watched the curve where the sedan took the line. He said no one saw the driver afterward, and the report guessed water pushed evidence downriver where it turned to silt. He said the tape he found made his chest hurt because someone with a badge kept people where the wind was worst. Kellen said he heard the pain and he believed the sincerity. Then he asked Ross to step back from the rail 1 foot. He said small choices add minutes, and minutes stack into plans, and plans turn into days that someone can live through. The cruiser moved a foot at a time. The officer called in with a whisper to confirm eyes on the subjects. The wind kicked a tab of paper along the sidewalk, and the camera caught it hopping like a small animal in rain. Kellen asked Ross about the cracked case at the pier, and Ross said the fisherman who found it gave him the phone. He said he cleaned the mud with rice and heat, and the screen woke like a held breath and showed the saved audio. Kellen pictured a kitchen table with towels and a humming space heater and the stubborn work of saving a last voice. He told Ross that someone who would do that kind of work could also stand away from the edge and breathe tonight. Ross said people kept calling him crazy when he brought the phone around, and one clerk said to forget old storms. He said he would go if someone could promise the message would not vanish into a hole where things get lost. Kellen had a rule: never promise anything that depends on someone else. He made a different promise instead and wrote it down. He said he would take a copy himself, and he would log it as a citizen recording attached to a supplemental report. He said he would list the time and origin as provided, and he would initial the line and add a contact number. Ross went quiet, and the wind filled the line again, and the cruiser stopped a car length away with no flashers. The officer on the bridge said he saw a second person keeping distance, and the cyclist raised the light toward the railing. Kellen asked Ross if hearing a small true thing might help him come off the rail. Ross told him to say it plain. Kellen told him there was an internal review back then, and it did not find a bribe, but it did find a silence. He said a manager failed to file a conflict disclosure, and a vendor had a nephew on a crew scheduled for that week. He said the manager resigned before the report made the rounds, and the findings lived behind a line marked personnel matter. He said he had read that line with tired eyes and wished it said more, and that was the part he kept. He did not say the other part out loud, which was the line about a recommended reprimand for delayed notifications. He did not say the name of the dispatcher who missed a handoff while moving units during the storm shift. He did not say that the reprimand belonged to him for a calendar mistake that lost 2 minutes when the server lagged. He believed the 2 minutes had not caused the death, yet he carried them like a coin that burned his pocket. Ross stood very still. He asked why no one told the public that someone had been asked to resign quietly. Kellen said the county tells what it must by law, and the rest gathers dust and waits for someone to ask again. He said he understood that wait, then asked Ross to walk toward the cruiser while the cyclist kept the light behind. Ross said he wanted to hand the phone over himself and watch it enter the chain that could not be erased. Kellen told the officer to receive the device and document the handoff on camera. Then he told the medic to stage closer. He kept talking to Ross about the quiet details of grief as the officer moved with hands open and calm shoulders. Ross stepped away from the rail, and the wind made the tension a little louder. Then the cruiser door clicked open. The officer took the phone and read the time on the screen for the camera, then thanked Ross and nodded at the cyclist. The medic stepped out with a blanket and stood near, and the cyclist said he would bike Ross home if that helped. Kellen set the line to a low hold and told Nira to mark the recording flagged for retention review and supervisory copy. He also wrote a note for himself to call records in the morning and ask for a manual pull from the deep archive. He would say the citizen copy exists and should be paired with any surviving log from the storm year for clarity. He would not say the rest, which was that he had been the one to misread the calendar view during a switch. He shifted to the closing questions that help people move. Any harm today? Any plan tonight? Any safe place to stay? Ross said he would stay with a friend who owed him a favor, and he would bring coffee to the cyclist as thanks. He said he would wait to hear if the recording matched the archive, and he would not visit the bridge again at night. Kellen said someone would call him within 3 business days, which felt safe to offer, and he wrote his own number anyway. He signed the log with a quick line and filed the incident under welfare resolved with evidence collected and no injury. The bridge camera caught the cruiser pulling away slow while the medic followed, and the cyclist lights faded toward the trail. Nira slid over a cup with fresh coffee and asked if he was okay, and he said yes, since people had stepped off safe. He picked up his notebook and drew a small square around the words he had written, which read, "Keep the silence clean." He drove home as rain dripped from the awning of the grocery, and the owner waved from a dark window with a thin smile. He unlocked the door and set his notebook on the table. Then he took the spare tape recorder from a drawer beside the sink. He spoke the date and the incident number and a short summary. Then he said 7 words that were just for the tape. He said the bridge call reminded him why small errors multiply and why a person can choose to carry them alone. In the morning, he brought the tape to the records clerk as a personal note to accompany the citizen copy for context. He did not include the part about his own reprimand, which lived on paper in a file that no one requested. He told the clerk that the caller needed confidence, that the system held memory, and the clerk said that part was done. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived to confirm the match, and the archived call contained the same phrase and timing. The letter said the review board would annotate the old memo to reflect the vendor relationship that had been missed. It also said the findings still pointed to weather and a panicked driver as primary causes rather than any delayed instruction. Kellen stood at the window and read the lines twice, then folded the letter and slid it under the notebook cover. He walked the long way to work and past the river that pretended to be quiet, while tugs moved lumber under the span. He thought about the part he had kept and judged whether it belonged in daylight or whether it still lived best in private. He decided to hold it until it served someone to hear it, which was not the same as hiding, and felt closer to care. The sound heard across Kenai fjords. Tour boats returning to Seward after a clear morning on Resurrection Bay reported a single deep tone that rolled like distant surf, although the water lay flat and the hills carried no echo. The first report came from a 39-year-old deckhand named Mason Kerr, who worked seasonally on wildlife tours and kept a pocket notebook for weather notes. He told his captain that the tone rose through the rail like a struck bell and lasted several seconds with a faint tremor underfoot. The captain marked the time and location in the log, with wind from the south and small ripples under an idle prop. Their passengers kept silent for a moment and then asked whether the sound came from a submarine near the entrance. The captain said the chart showed no restricted area that morning and the harbor office had posted no advisories for training. A 28-year-old kayak guide named Lila Torres was leading a half-day trip near Fox Island for a group of visitors from Anchorage who wanted calm water and photos. She later wrote that the tone arrived like pressure on the chest and the kayaks shivered in a tight cluster before the water went still again. She radioed a brief notice on Channel 16 and used the working channel to ask if any tour vessel was running a new horn. Two operators answered that their horns had not sounded and that their engines were near idle with whale watching underway. Her clients asked whether glaciers made music, and she said calving usually cracked or thundered rather than hummed. Dispatch logs from the Seward Harbor office show a cluster of calls within a 10-minute window that afternoon from tour captains and one fishing skiff. The entries note a low-frequency tone heard across Eyelock Bay with no visible source and no visible spray or plume. A state trooper boat near Bear Glacier reportedly paused to check for slides and found loose, brash ice pushing against a rocky point. The crew recorded air temperature and barometer fall from morning levels and then continued a shoreline patrol toward the bay entrance. The log does not list distress or mechanical failure after the tone, and no injuries were recorded. Park staff collected statements over 2 days because visitors kept bringing the same story into the small office near the docks. A seasonal ranger named Glenn Hart, 47, kept a legal pad on his desk and asked the same 5 questions about time and direction and duration. He wrote that impressions differed on compass bearing even when groups stood together on the same deck for the same minute. He also wrote that many described a feeling in the ribs before the ears caught up, which suggested vibration through hulls and rocks. His notes describe calm voices and measured pauses rather than panic or excitement. Archived notes from the Park Learning Center describe known sounds that travel far along the fjords during specific weather patterns and tide stages. Staff listed glacial calving that booms across glassy water and carries round corners when air is dense and winds are light. They also listed distant thunder from summer storms that bend around the Kenai Mountains and arrive as a soft pulse at ground level. A retired pilot contributed a comment about mountain wave activity that can press air downward and make waves slap rock faces with a sudden synchronized thud. The center added that underwater landslides produce tones that resonate in bays, yet seldom leave obvious surface traces. State records for small seismic events show no local quake at the exact minute written in the tour logs for that weekend. A technician in Anchorage compared regional instruments and found weak tremors earlier in the day that did not align with the reported tone. He suggested a subaerial rockfall into deep water could ring like a struck drum with little visible splash from a long distance. He also said steep walls near the outer bays can mask origin and send energy along submerged ledges. His memo closed with a note that further inspection would require a focused hydrophone survey and a slow pass across likely shelves. Some locals claimed the sound began near Northwestern Lagoon, where calving fronts sometimes shed slabs the size of buildings during warm spells. A charter captain countered that he saw no fresh debris lines on the tide and that seals rested undisturbed on the floes. A kayak guide said the tone felt too pure for ice and too long for a crack or a crumble. Another guide said ice can sing when air pockets collapse underwater and chambers resonate like pipes built into the bergs. Investigators never confirmed whether any glacier in the park produced a tone with the same simple character described by visitors. The county file from 2009 contains references to a similar report during an autumn.com that drew two patrols to the outer coastline. The file mentions a low hum heard near the mouth of Resurrection Bay while fog sat heavy over the water and engines idled. Crews found a fresh slump on a remote slope that had slipped into a pocket cove and left a curved scar above the tide line. The report notes that ice and rock mixed in the slide and that the cove deepened rapidly from the beach. That event generated no injuries and closed no areas, yet it became a lesson about hidden energy along steep shores. Mason kept writing in his notebook during the week because passengers continued to ask about the sound and whether it meant trouble for tours. He recorded wind shifts and swell periods and any unusual echo from gull cries against the cliffs. He wrote that engines at idle produced normal vibration with no overlap into the low tone they had heard on the first day. He also wrote that the crew checked bilge spaces and shaft alignment and found nothing that could carry a pure tone through the hull. His final entry for the week simply read, "No recurrence during normal routes with weather stable and visibility fair." Lila met two park educators near the boat ramp and answered a list of short questions that were printed for consistency across interviews. She repeated that the tone climbed through her boat before she fully heard it, which made her think of pressure more than sound. She said her clients quieted and held their paddles low, as if a wake would arrive, but the water stayed nearly flat. She mentioned a faint rattle among small stones near the beach that began after the tone ended, which struck her as delayed movement. The educators thanked her and marked direction, uncertain, duration, 5 seconds quality musical, rather than percussive, with a note to verify tides. Rumors of naval testing reached the harbor within days because distant security zones sometimes appear without much notice along the Gulf. A liaison officer who stood by for public calls said no range activity had been scheduled for the recorded hour. He explained that some sonar pulses are audible to people under specific conditions, yet training avoids popular corridors during busy seasons. He added that the recorded ferry times and tour traffic would argue strongly against a scheduled run through the bay mouth. The harbor office kept his statement on file and listed it next to other letters that addressed similar concerns. A science volunteer from Fairbanks brought a portable recorder and a small hydrophone to Ayalik Bay after the first reports filled social feeds. He ran a set of drifts in quiet coves and clipped his gear to moorings while keeping notes with tide times and wind readings. The recordings captured normal boat traffic and the chewing crackle of shrimp and occasional distant rumbles from glacier faces. They did not capture a single clean tone that matched the witness descriptions, despite fair weather and many patient hours. His summary said that absence on his device did not erase the event and that chance and timing rule many field efforts. Visitors returned to Seward with the story and repeated the same careful phrase to outfitters and ticket clerks across several days. They said the sound carried through rails and plastic seats and into bones with calm water and sunny glare. Some remembered a bird silence for a count of 3, while others remembered gulls still calling from a far rock. Several believed a second, softer tone followed a breath later, although others denied hearing any echo at all. Records conflict on that point, and the files highlight the split on memory formed by surprise and light and distance. Autumn moved over the fjords, and the tour schedule thinned, while the harbor quieted between late returns and cold mornings. Park staff closed interviews and boxed their notes with copies of the dispatch logs and the seismic memo and the liaison letter. The working explanation settled on a localized slump into deep water that rang across the inlets with helpful weather. Another line in the file allowed that a submerged ice arch could have collapsed and formed a temporary resonator that sang once. Investigators never confirmed a specific ridge or cove, and the case file ended with a simple statement that the fjords keep their margins in motion. Mason left town before snow and promised to check recordings during the winter if any passengers sent clips by email. Lila kept guiding for 2 more weeks and said the water grew heavy with early swell that pressed against the islands. She told friends that the tone joined her list of things that happen once and bend the world without leaving a clean footprint. She added that clear days carry strange gifts when sound can travel for miles along rock and air and glassy water. She planned to return in spring because the routes were steady and the coves kept teaching quiet lessons to patient crews. The stories. This abandoned cabin is a warning trap in winter. The old cabin beside the county line looks empty from the road during storms. Yet a warm porch light appears. Drivers aim for it when whiteout wipes the world because a light means shelter, or at least a neighbor. Rhea Calder is 36 and works as a county snow operations supervisor, and she keeps a spiral notebook of storm anomalies. She shows up before dawn, checks blades and salt loads, and marks complaint calls with a thin blue pen. Her goal this morning is simple: get the ridge plowed before the school runs, then swing by a trouble spot. The spot is a bend near an abandoned mining cabin, where people keep calling for help when the sky goes white. The incident that changes her plan starts with two archived calls that ping the same mile marker and both mention the same porch light. The first caller said the light flicked on like someone waved them in, and then their SUV sank past the axle in drifted powder. The second caller said he saw reflective stakes like a private driveway, and he trusted the stakes and followed them in. Rhea drives out with a plow and a county ranger, and the wind pulls spindrift across the hood like milk. She idles beside the bend, then walks the last stretch on a packed lane that should not exist. The lane is narrow, precisely the width of a small plow, and the snow on its edges shows a scalloped bite that her crews do not leave. She studies the porch light, which is wired to a salvaged marine battery and a hockey puck-sized solar panel. The cabin window is boarded, yet bare footprints cross the porch, and the snow on the mat is tamped smooth with a boot heel. A battery radio inside clicks on and off on weather band, then goes silent like a timer has died. A tow truck appears before Rhea can call the last caller back, and the driver waves from a bright red cab. He introduces himself as Tully Grange, and he says he just happened to be nearby, which is unlikely on a weekday morning before the bus runs. He backs toward the trapped SUV with a practiced arc, then stops when Rhea holds up a hand. "This is county equipment," she says. And he shrugs, then says he can wait in the pullout. She notes the pullout was not there last week, because she passed here in a smaller storm and saw only brush and drift. The fresh gravel under his tires is a tan quartz blend not used by their supplier, which her crews call peach pit gravel because it stains gloves. Complication lands in small details that refuse to match, and details are the only honest witnesses in bad weather. The reflective stakes near the porch are county colors, yet the plastic sleeves are slightly glossy, which means hardware store knockoffs. The stake spacing mirrors a county driveway template, yet the end flare is reversed, which a training manual would not allow. She opens her spiral and writes the count of stakes and the order of colors, then photographs each with her phone. The ranger sets a trail camera on a fence post, angled at the bend, and another on the porch beam, both tagged with the hour and coordinates. Rhea pulls a corner of the mat and finds two zip ties and a clipped wire, both wet from this morning, not last week. Investigation moves step by step when the storm pauses and the phones ring less, so she visits a gas station near the turnoff. The clerk says a red tow truck fills up on calm days and buys coffee for anyone who mentions the cabin. A retired school bus driver named Lauren Ibarra stops for a paper, and he says he saw private plow tracks peel off before the storm, then vanish in wind. She requests dispatch logs for the past 3 winters and filters for that mile marker, then highlights clusters that pair with heavy snow. Callers mention the same porch light, the same reflective stakes, and the same quick tow arrival, which dispatch marks as helpful. She watches a dash cam clip from last month where the light clicks on as the hood swings left, then the video ends with a soft crunch. Archived calls from 2021 mention a ham radio voice that says shelter is nearby, and then silence like a squelch cut. A volunteer firefighter says in a witness statement that the cabin used to be a safety cache and now nobody claims ownership. A Forest Service mail thread she prints at the office says the cabin fell off the map after a boundary change in 2019. Rhea returns with 2 crew trucks and a trooper who knows every rancher along that ridge, and they wait for nightfall. A thin moon slides behind blown cloud, and the porch light pops alive at the first gust, soft and steady like a welcome sign. A compact pickup rolls up from the far side with its lights off, then a figure hops out and crouches at the porch corner. The ranger whispers that the figure holds a small remote, and the light changes from dim to bright after a thumb tap. Rhea steps forward and says, "Good evening," and the figure bolts toward the pickup, then slips where the packed lane meets churned gravel. The trooper covers the exit with his lights, and the pickup idles in a pool of steam, and the figure surrenders with hands up. They identify him as a subcontractor to Grange Recovery, and his jacket pockets hold a keychain remote and 2 spare batteries. Zip ties match the ones under the mat, and a roll of reflective tape matches the stakes, which are cut to driveway template lengths. He says he was only maintaining a safety light and keeping the lane open, which is not a service the county requested. Rhea stays methodical, because motive hides under habit, not speeches that arrive too fast. She asks where the gravel came from, and he says a supplier in the valley, yet the receipts in his glove box show a hardware warehouse 2 counties south. She asks why the radio trips a loop on weatherband after the door opens, and he says it helps people feel calm. She compiles a timeline that starts with a bridge closure 3 winters ago, which pushed navigation apps toward this county road. Drivers used the cabin light as a wayfinder during whiteouts, while their maps insisted the bend belonged to a safe connector. The subcontractor and a partner groomed a false lane with a small plow, then dragged a lure line past the porch to a drift. Vehicles followed the stakes and the shine, then sank where the wind always filled the cut, and then a tow contract appeared fast. The subcontractor had a scanner tuned for dispatch, and he shadowed snow squalls, then nudged the light when a hood turned. The porch light served as both promise and bait, a warning tone that pretended to help while herding people toward trouble. The twist clicks when Rhea notices something everyone else ignored, because details are stubborn and patient when money moves. The stakes used county colors, yet the white stripe appears cream at dusk, which happens when old tape yellows in cold. The county only switched to that tape after a backorder last spring, yet the stakes showed last winter, which means someone copied and refreshed. She pulls a photo from the first cluster of calls and zooms on a stake that leans at a slant near a spruce. A boot print sits at the base with a split heel pattern, and the subcontractor wears the same make, which the trooper confirms. The peach pit gravel under the pullout matches bags stacked in the pickup bed, stamped with a store brand not used locally. They bring in Tully Grange on a quiet afternoon, and he arrives calm, carrying a thermos with a sticker from a drag racing track. He says he never told anyone to follow that light, and he is right in the narrow way salesmen are right. He made sure the light stayed visible from the highway, and he made sure the false lane looked exactly like a private driveway. Rhea uses her spiral notes and dispatch timestamps and the dashcam clip to assemble a proof that a prosecutor can lift. The proof is plain. The lane grooming aligns with tow arrivals, and the light remote explains the synchronized porch glow. The radio loop satisfies a claim of safety service, yet the loop trips only when a door opens after a driver commits. Witnesses give short statements. A school custodian says he saw stakes in a truck behind the parts store, and a rancher remembers a trailer loaded with gravel. A hardware buyer confirms past orders of reflective sleeves and tape in county patterns, then prints invoices with dates that match storm weeks. The trail camera video shows the subcontractor stepping off distances with a tape measure, then pressing reflectors into drifted banks. The county files charges on false markings in a long list of fraud-related counts, and the state adds a charge tied to interference. Rhea builds a corrective plan with simple steps: remove the stakes, angle the porch light away from the bend, and post clear closure boards. She requests new advance signs that warn of no outlet during storms, and the road team builds a berm past the bend. In spring, she visits the cabin in daylight when the stream runs high and the spruce throws a clean shadow. The boards are still up, and the marine battery sits in a crate with a tag that says evidence in blocky marker. She writes a last page in the spiral: cabin neutralized, tow arrivals normal, and local drivers back to watching the sky instead of a lure. She keeps the dashcam clip on her work desktop as a reminder of how easily stressed people choose the first light they see. She writes a line on a training slide: never chase glow in a whiteout, choose distance markers and windbreaks and patience. She speaks at a town meeting using plain words, then thanks the bus drivers and the ranch hands who notice small things that save bigger things. According to a statement filed later, the subcontractor said he borrowed the idea from a forum where recovery outfits shared winter tips. The forum is archived now, and the thread title mentions hazard magnets, which makes her jaw tighten in a quiet office. She forwards the archive to a state liaison, then shuts her laptop and listens to the heater tick inside the shop. 2 winters later, a driver who once followed the light sends the department a short letter with a photo of the bend in Sunday. The letter says, "Thank you for fixing the trap, and thank you for posting signs that speak like a human, not a brochure." Ria pins the photo on the bulletin board and draws a small check beside the mile marker on a laminated map. The cabin still stands, where the wind stacks powder against the wall, and a jay hops along the porch rail after a thaw. People talk about that porch like a lucky star in a bad stretch. Yet the real luck was a person with a notebook. A false beacon is a cruel thing in winter, and the fix was not a heroic beatdown, only careful eyes and a stop. She drives past when each first snow begins, then checks the berm and the markers and the culvert past the spruce. The road hums under studded tires, and the bend looks like any other bend in a county full of the same bends. She knows a trap can wear a smile and a soft bulb, and a warning means nothing unless it points away from harm. The old cabin still looks empty if you do not look close, and light can lie when money needs help. Ria prefers the dull honesty of a reflector that never blinks, and a berm that refuses to pretend it is a road. She closes her spiral at the end of each shift and treats winter like a puzzle that pays back the patient mind. The stories. The quiet truth inside that coastal hospital wing. The hospital sat 2 blocks from the water, and the wing that faced the inlet stayed quiet through every busy shift. People joked about the sea air, then lowered their voices near that corridor like sound itself preferred to drift away there. On a mild spring morning, Leora Penn showed up with her coffee and a checklist, planning to finish safety checks before lunch. She was 34, and she worked as the environmental services supervisor, which meant she tracked odors, stains, leaks, and things nobody wanted to notice. She liked simple goals, like swapping cracked casters on linen bins before anyone tripped while rushing a patient. The storm last week flooded a basement stairwell, and today she wanted to log the final moisture readings and close the work order. Everything else could wait until the afternoon. Her plans changed before the first break. A nurse from the cardiac floor stopped her by the supply elevator and asked a question that landed with a small cold wait. "Did you move a bed out of 12 East overnight?" the nurse asked, because that room looked freshly mopped and nobody had the call light plugged in. Leora said no, then walked the nurse back to 12 East. The room held a made bed, smooth as a catalog photo, the kind of smooth that usually meant empty or staged. The call light cord curled like a quiet reminder, and the plug lay against clean tile. The monitor cart blinked in standby, which was normal if a discharge happened, which the board said had not. She pulled her phone and checked the overnight service log. The log showed a water alarm cleared at 3:12, plus a linen delivery at 3:28, and the standard generator test at 3:30. Nothing about a bed move. The floor techs had signed off at 4, which tracked with the rotation. She felt the wing hush in her ears as they stepped into the hall. The hush was not spooky, just oddly firm, like the sound of a theater after the speakers cut. She remembered 2 other techs mentioning the same hush months ago, which she had written down as acoustic weirdness from the renovation. The walls from the pre-1980 edition met the newer drywall at shallow angles, which could bend sound enough to make a whisper vanish. The nurse pointed down the corridor toward rooms 14 through 20, which were half full after the storm transfers. "You ever notice the alarms sound softer here?" she said, "even with doors open?" That question turned a small worry into a task. Leora thanked her, then called Rafi Soto from facilities, who was 41 and worked nights on chillers and pressure monitors. Rafi said he could meet her after he ran a test on the pharmacy air handlers. She told him 12 East first, and to bring his handheld sound meter. While she waited, she checked the housekeeping closet and found a single wet mop hung wrong side up, which bothered her more than it should. The rag bucket held 5 clean tags, which meant 1 tag missing. She counted cart liners, then photographed the tag numbers, then texted her team group, which answered with the usual thumbs and jokes. Rafi walked in with his meter and a grin, then lost the grin when he heard the haul. He held up the meter while a monitor alarm chirped in room 16. The reading was lower than upstairs by real points, not just a little. He tried the code blue test switch on the mock panel, and the hallway speaker tone sounded like a phone in another apartment. They stood there for a quiet minute that stretched. She felt the cool push of air on her ankles, like a vent trying too hard. Raffi crouched and checked the gap under door 18, then looked at a ceiling return. This wing was set for negative pressure during a flu surge, he said, and someone forgot to return the dampers. That could pull sound into the duct runs. They both knew sound should not disappear completely, and hospital speakers had their own lines, but the observation mattered. Leora asked if maintenance logs showed damper positions. Raffi said the old building used manual marks with paint dashes after a storm, and sometimes those faded. He called his lead, who checked archived notes from winter. The notes reportedly listed a temporary negative pressure setting for isolation overflow and a reminder to reset after discharge. The reminder had no follow-up check line, which could be simple human miss and not a cover for anything worse. Still, the room felt staged wrong. Leora walked back to 12 East, then took photos of the made bed from 3 angles, partly habit, partly evidence. She opened the closet and found a folded patient gown without a size sticker, which was nothing by itself. She checked the Sharps container seal, then stepped into the bathroom and looked at the floor drain for silt patterns. The ring looked clean in a way that suggested a recent rinse, not a final deep clean. She called central coverage and asked if a float nurse had swapped rooms overnight. The charge nurse checked dispatch logs for bed control and found a 1-minute call at 3:29 that dropped before anyone spoke, which felt like a butt dial or a cold finger hitting end. The caller ID showed the station handset in this wing. Leora went to the security office and asked for hallway footage. The officer on duty, a patient man named Colm Reyes, 37, pulled the clip from 3:15 to 4. They watched the split screens without commentary. At 3:17, a linen cart rolled in from the elevator without a staff badge visible. The cart moved slowly, with one wheel catching, which matched the caster she meant to swap today. At 3:19, the cart paused outside 12 East, then shifted, then kept moving toward the end of the hall. They watched for the badge reader hits that should flank every elevator entry on that floor. The system registered 1 badge at 3:14 from Raffi earlier, and 1 at 4 from a night nurse, and none for the cart. Cullum explained that carts come up with drivers who badge at the service basement, then sometimes ride with a different staffer when floors swap loads. That could account for the missing badge, and also could not. They checked the service elevator camera and caught the same cart doors sliding open at 3:16. The elevator captured a slice of reflective plastic and the edge of a sleeve, no clear face, and the time overlay blinked because of the generator test. The overlay sync had drifted last week, which Cullum was already fixing, which meant timestamps needed cross-checks against other clocks. Leora asked for a still from the moment the cart paused at 12 East. Colm printed a page with the grainy frame that showed the cart handle and a sliver of the room placard. She carried the print back to the wing and held it near the door under the light. The sliver matched the height of the placard, which confirmed little, but the angle of the cart showed the handle turned inward, which delivery staff rarely did when rolling past. She took out her moisture reader and checked the wall behind the bed. The numbers showed dry, which fit the recent mopping. She checked the strip beneath the bed casters and saw a thin gray smear that did not look like dust. She swabbed it with a clean wipe and noted a faint powdery drag on the cloth, not slippery like floor finish. She sent the wipe to Central Supply with a note asking for a basic powder test, which was really a habit from her last job at a larger facility. In that job, she once traced a peculiar residue back to construction dust tracked from a blocked stairwell, which explained an odd cough cluster that week. She had learned that small housekeeping notes sometimes solved problems everyone else framed as strange luck. By late morning, she had a sketch of the corridor on her clipboard with marks for return vents and speaker positions. Raffi walked the ceiling path and found a junction where 2 return lines met above room 15, which could create a pressure sink if one line pulled harder. He said he would check the damper blades for manual marks, then pulled down a tile and sighed at a rusted screw. "This wing is like a ship that forgot how to float," he said, which she appreciated. A nurse from 19, an older man named Keaton Ward, 49, stopped by and mentioned something from Winter. He said he heard a voice on the hall speaker one night that sounded like a whisper on a phone. Just one word that might have been wait. He filed the report with his supervisor and chalked it up to a bleed from the intercom test. He offered to show his written statement, which he kept in a folder because he kept everything. His statement matched the time when isolation overflow ended, which lined up with the damper story. Leora worked through lunch and built a timeline with the clearest markers. The service log showed an alarm at 3:12 and a linen event at 3:28. The call log showed a 1-minute station call at 3:29. The camera showed a cart at 3:19 by the hall feed with a possible overlay drift. The badge system had no hit at the elevator at 3:16, likely because of a basement badge only. None of that explained the made bed and the unplugged call light. She checked the oxygen cylinder rack in the utility room and counted 2 empties in the wrong slots. The exchange sheets said 4 full arrived yesterday afternoon, with 2 used overnight in rooms 17 and 20. That math should yield 2 full and instead showed 1, which could be a miscount or something more routine, like a cylinder staged for respiratory and not logged. She asked respiratory, who checked their sheet and said they had pulled 1 extra for a transfer that ended up canceled, and that the cylinder sat by a stairwell for 10 minutes while a therapist helped a patient. The therapist sent a note with the time, which was 3:25, which touched the period where things felt odd. By mid-afternoon, Central Supply texted back a photo of the wipe, with a small note. The powder fluoresced under a standard light test in a way that fit with foot powder or a powdered latex glove residue, not construction dust. That pointed back toward a human routine, not a leak from upstairs. The note did not accuse a person, and it did not need to. She went back to 12 East and sat in a guest chair and listened. She heard the sea through glass and vents, a soft hush without rhythm. She leaned forward and spoke into the empty room, a simple line that felt like testing a bridge. If anyone adjusted your alarms to keep the peace, I will put them back where they belong. Rafi returned with a small rag of paint, marked with faded red dashes. He had found the damper blades set to a position used during winter isolation, which explained part of the quiet. He reset the blades to neutral, then ran the test tone again. The hallway speaker sounded like a real alarm finally, and 2 nurses popped their heads out with startled faces, which reassured her and annoyed them. They still had to explain the made bed and the unplugged cord. She checked the discharge board again and found no new names, just a morning transfer to imaging. She pulled archived calls and found another brief call at 3:31 from the same station that ended without audio, which now looked like someone purging a stuck line. Column radioed that he found a maintenance note from Winter that instructed staff to purge stale intercom channels after negative pressure resets, which nobody had repeated since. They called the linen contractor and asked about the overnight driver swap pattern. The contractor said his drivers usually wheel carts onto the elevator and ride to the target floor, but during generator tests, they sometimes stop 1 floor early and let a staffer guide the cart to avoid stopping between floors. He checked his dispatch sheet and found a driver note that said elevator stopped short during test, staff pushed to 12, all good. He could not give a name, only the time block. By late afternoon, the picture sharpened enough to make sense without drama. A generator test overlapped with a linen delivery and a damper setting that muffled alarms. A staffer moved a delivery cart, paused by 12 East, noticed the mop bucket, pushed the cart aside, and quickly mopped a spill. The staffer made the bed to help, then forgot the call light plug during the rush. The unplugged cord did not match best practice, which would be fixed with a reminder, not a report that accused anyone. The part that still bothered her had to do with the oxygen cylinder timing and the extra pause by the stairwell. She asked Colm to pull stairwell footage if available, which he did, and showed a therapist propping the door while holding a cylinder with one arm and shepherding a patient with the other. The patient looked steady, which matched a canceled transport returning to bed. The moment accounted for the missing cylinder, which returned to the rack at 3:43. She closed her notebook and wrote an incident review in plain language. The review recommended returning dampers to neutral after surge events, verifying hallway speaker levels during generator tests, and making a fast rule about plugging call cords before remaking any bed. She added a line about how lavender air freshener should stay out of patient rooms because it could mask odors that indicate a problem. She always added that line, and sometimes it stuck. Before she left the wing, the nurse from earlier walked up with a small, tired smile. "So, not a haunting," she said. "Just a lot of people doing 3 jobs at once." Leora nodded and answered with the calm confidence of someone who had stared at too many messes that looked like mysteries. "It is pretty much always the simple chain," she said, "and sometimes the chain gets quiet enough that nobody notices the missing link." That evening, after the emails went out, she stood by the loading dock and watched the inlet. The tide came in without hurrying, and the gulls wrote slow lines across the air that nobody would ever read. The wing would sound normal tomorrow, which meant patients would hear every beep that mattered, and staff would hear every page that counted. The quiet truth had not been a ghost, or a cover, or a headline. It had been dampers, timing, human judgment, and a hallway that swallowed sound for a while. She locked the dock door and tucked her clipboard into her bag. She would never tell the story with flair, because the unsung fixes never loved applause. She would remember the hush, though, and the way it taught her to trust the boring explanations first, then test them anyway. In a building stacked with lives and wires, truth rarely shouted. It arrived like a tide in a coastal wing, steady and patient, and loud enough once you fixed the vents. The stories. This motel room voicemail rerouted search teams that winter. They kept saying it started with a motel room that smelled like old coffee and bleach, and with a voicemail nobody expected. The recordings came out in late winter after a storm knocked power across the county and kicked the motel phones awake again. Rhea Tavener was 37 and worked as an emergency coordinator for a spread-out mountain county that never felt ready. She had a habit of keeping paper maps rolled in a rubber band and a small camera tucked under her parka. That morning, she wanted only to rebalance commitments and check that the warming shelter had enough cots for the week. She planned to drive the Ridge Road, swing by the radio repeater, and be back before lunch. The incident started when the Nightlark Motel on the highway called the non-emergency line with a strange message they could not clear. The manager, a tired man named Cal Rudd, told the dispatcher that a red light on room 26 blinked, and the phone kept chiming. He said the display showed a new voicemail that would not delete, and he wanted someone to listen because the guest had left. Rhea took the secondary call because the sheriff's deputies were stacked with fender benders on the main grade. She arrived to find the lobby heater making a low metallic whine, and Cal behind a counter with a cracked bell. He slid the room key and nodded toward the outside corridor, his voice flat from too many nights at the same desk. Rhea used nitrile gloves from her field kit, then lifted the handset and dialed the code that the placard said would access messages. The voicemail opened with a tone and a computerized voice reading the timestamp in a clipped monotone. The date announced sounded like last night near 10, according to her quick notes scratched with a blunt pencil. The message that followed had the kind of audio that police technicians describe as close but muddy, and it made her shoulders rise. A woman whispered that a man was hurt, and she asked for help. Then she mentioned mile marker numbers and a guardrail that bent inward toward a runoff ditch. There was wind noise and the distant thrum of trucks, and what Rhea believed might be the quick chirp of a turn signal. The caller finished with words that sounded like 2 names, then a tired exhale, then silence long enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. By the time she walked back to the lobby, the dispatcher had already compared mile markers that matched those numbers on the East Highway spur. A search team was gathering at the fairgrounds with 2 four-wheelers and a county plow driver who knew every ditch by seat memory. Rhea signed the log and relayed what she heard, and her own words hardened into directions that sent good people toward a cold bend. An hour later, a second caller reached the tip line and said they had heard the same voicemail when calling the motel to complain about their refund. That person repeated the marker numbers and added that a dog barked once in the background, which persuaded the consensus further. Witness statements began clustering around the East Spur, and a deputy noted in the dispatch log that he had seen a bent guardrail near marker 32 2 days prior. The search teams rolled that way in a slow line of lights that looked brave against the blank sky. Rhea drove separately and scanned plow berms that faced the wind, because snow settles in patterns that trap fresh tire ruts longer. She told herself that the timestamp was clean, and that the voice felt close and that people needed her to stay practical. The first mile produced a stranded sedan with a dead battery and a sheepish driver, and the second mile delivered a drift that swallowed half the lane. They found nothing that matched a serious wreck, only plastic shrapnel and a glove lost last week, which made her think about timing again. Back at the fairgrounds, a radio operator replayed the voicemail on a speaker, and the group leaned in. Rhea asked Cal for the motel's phone vendor contact, and he brought out a binder with hand-printed notes in thick marker. She called the vendor and asked about power cycles and about date behavior when the system lost time, and the technician promised to check archival events. She returned to the voicemail and listened for anything that placed a person rather than a highway, because people leave fingerprints in sound if you keep still. The second listen gave her something new that felt small but pointed. Right after the caller said the mile marker numbers, the wind changed tone for half a second, then a faint clack sounded like an elevator door. That did not belong near a rural guardrail, and it made her write elevator with a question mark next to it, which was not her usual habit. She also caught the soft bleep of a room keycard reader, which could have been the motel hallway if the phone had been on speaker, or a different building entirely. She left the fairgrounds and drove back to the Nightlark with the camera on the seat, planning to map every sound in the hallway against her memory. Cal mentioned that room 26 sat above the ice machine and that the elevator had a sticky door that made a little clap. She asked who stayed in that room last night, and his ledger showed a single occupancy, paid in cash, by someone who wrote a name that did not match any local license. He shrugged and said the guest checked out at 6 and that housekeeping already turned the room. Rhea asked to see the housekeeping cart, and the housekeeper, a careful woman named Jillian North, said she had found the room tidy. Jillian said the phone had been off the hook at first, which she corrected, and she said the window faced the back lot where trucks idled. Rhea asked if anyone had used the lobby phone when power returned, and Jillian said a traveler borrowed it while waiting for a ride that morning. That detail felt important because lobby phones sometimes route through the same server as the room phones, which can create strange behavior. The vendor called back and reported that their server recorded an abnormal offset during the storm, which could shift timestamps for local voicemail. He said the system fell back to a factory clock tied to a different zone, and then resynced once the internet returned, which can mislabel messages. He promised to send a small report, and Rhea wrote down the gist, then underlined the word offset because she disliked anything that moved signposts during a search. The dispatcher added a note in the log with that information, and the group paused to reassess direction. Rhea listened again and measured the gaps between key clicks and the turn signal chirp, and she kept hearing something like a vending machine compressor. She stepped into the hallway and held her phone down by the ice machine, and her recording later showed the same humming cadence. The voicemail might not have been a live plea from a ditch, but could instead be a message recorded in the building and then captured by the motel system during the storm. She asked Cal whether any old messages archived on the server could return as new after a reset. Cal admitted that he had once lost all messages after a lightning strike and then found them again as new after a technician visit. He said the phone guy joked about ghosts calling back to settle their bills, which did not sound funny to Rhea at that moment. She pressed for dates and asked whether past incidents lined up with heavy weather, and he nodded toward a clipboard full of repair tickets. The dates matched cold weeks when snow slid from the roof, and the idea of an old message waking up felt more likely with each line. The next step was to figure out who had left the recording, and whether the details pointed to the East Spur or somewhere entirely different. Rhea asked for prior registration cards for room 26, and Cal produced a stack bound with a rubber band that snapped on the counter. She gently sorted through and found a multi-night stay from late last winter under a name that also did not match a license. The rate was discounted for cash, and the note column said, "Truck Lot View," which fit the sound of idling engines in the message. She then called the State Patrol office and asked for any incidents last winter that involved a bent guardrail near any similar marker numbers. The trooper on duty searched reports and told her there had been a slide-off on the West Highway spur near marker 32 during a storm in late February. He said the driver had fled before dawn, and a passing snowplow called it in, and the car was recovered later without injuries, according to the archived calls. That wreck would have put a person back in town by breakfast, and possibly in a motel room across from trucks, Rhea returned to the audio and timed the interval between the words and the faint elevator clap, and then timed the lobby elevator with her own phone recording. The match was not perfect, but close enough that a court would likely call it consistent under ordinary conditions, according to her training notes. She also realized the turn signal chirp probably belonged to a guest being dropped at the front door, not a car on the highway. The dog bark could have been a pet in the lot, which often happens near the vending area after check-in. She asked the radio operator to broadcast a simple clarification and to slow the east spur sweep while a second team checked the west. The deputy, who remembered the bent rail on the east, admitted he might have mixed the side of the county in his earlier note, which happens when shifts run long. The west team found the old repair spot with fresh snow around the posts and an evidence marker for a past accident half buried under ice. It seemed the voicemail referenced a prior event that had already closed, and their winter storm had wrapped it in new confusion. Rhea then visited the neighboring diner, where the night shift sometimes noticed details people forgot to hide, and she asked about the guest who paid in cash. The server, a college student named Del Finch, said a man sat alone near the window around 9, then stepped outside to take a call. Del remembered because the man cupped his hand over the motel phone receiver in the lobby, which struck Del as old-fashioned, and then asked for a ride to the bus station. That would place the phone call inside the building. During the same hour, the voicemail claimed she requested the motel camera footage for the hallway by room 26, and Cal said the system stored 2 weeks, which happened to straddle their storm. The timestamp on the clip showed a flicker at 9:58, right before the server saw the man on the lobby phone, which made her careful notes lean toward a local recording. A county technician extracted the audio from the clip, and while it was muddy, a mechanical ding from the elevator landed exactly where her earlier timing suggested. The odds of a live highway recording sharing those indoor sounds felt very small. The twist arrived quietly when the vendor finally sent logs that showed the voicemail database replayed queued items after resyncing and labeled some as new. One item matched a stored call from late winter last year that had been partially corrupted, then reconstructed during the reboot. The metadata showed room 26 as the destination for that older call, which explained the light and the stubborn message and made the puzzle sad rather than sinister. The message people heard belonged to a different night and a different problem that resolved without tragedy, and it had been pulled forward by a storm. Rhea wrote a summary for the incident file that emphasized the difference between live audio and replayed audio, then highlighted the risks during outages. She recommended an added step where dispatch confirms time against independent sources when a tip arrives through a system that just recovered. She also asked the motel to change their default message code and to put a note by the desk to call her office if room phones behave oddly after storms. Cal agreed and added a bright sticker to the binder with her number, which made her smile despite the long day. The search teams returned after noon with tired faces and a neat inventory, and they ate chili from a crock that steamed the fairgrounds office. Rhea thanked each person by name and reminded them that a wrong turn during a fast morning did not mean a bad job. She said the lesson was about signals and systems and about winter technology that lies twice, and everyone nodded while they warmed their hands. She filled out the reimbursement forms for fuel and gloves and slid the packet into the outgoing tray with a note for finance. In the evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the paper map unfurled and marked the motel with a small circle. She added a line toward the west spur and penciled in the marker numbers with a question mark to reflect how close memory can sit to fact. She listened to the voicemail one last time through headphones, and this time the vending machine compressor sounded obvious enough that she wondered how she missed it earlier. Fatigue makes patterns where there are none, and urgency can turn a whisper into a highway without much effort. A week later, the vendor installed a firmware update that locked time against a battery backup so power glitches could not shift anything. The sheriff added a line to the dispatch checklist about confirming independent clocks, and the radio operator taped a bold reminder above the console. Jillian named the ice machine Manny as a joke in the break room because it hummed in the same rhythm as the recording. Del laughed and said the elevator still clapped, but only when someone shoved a luggage cart too hard against the door. In a different winter years ago, the same storm pattern had toppled a repeater and blacked out an entire valley, which lived in Rhea's head. She thought about that while walking past a wall of snow tools at the supply shed, and she decided to put spare batteries for hotel systems on the grant list. It felt like a small change inside a big map, and that was how she survived seasons that piled risk on top of routine tasks. She pinned the grant idea to her bulletin board and wrote a short sentence that read, "Verify time before direction." No one ever found the man who left the cash registration during the recent night because he boarded the bus and vanished into ordinary life. The earlier driver from last winter had been located and fined, according to the archived paperwork, which made that thread tidy in the official sense. The county slid back into the rhythm of plows and calls and an occasional lost tourist, and the motel phone stayed quiet except for room wake-ups. The red light over room 26 stopped blinking, and the ice machine chugged along with stubborn loyalty. Rhea kept the pencil notes in a folder labeled with the motel name and the date and included a copy of the vendor logs. She handed a training copy to the new deputy class and asked them to listen once without context, then again with the building map. The exercise worked because people learned how easily a detail snaps a hunch in half, and how worth it is to test every hunch. They left with a habit of checking other clocks before sending trucks into the cold, which is the sort of habit that quietly saves lives. By late spring, the guardrail on the west spur reflected the sun with a fresh coat of paint, and the plow berms had slipped away. The fairgrounds chili pot was replaced with a cooler of sports drinks, and the radio chatter turned toward camping permits and picnic warnings. Nobody brought up the voicemail during the season kickoff meeting, but everyone remembered the morning they chased a ghost along the east spur. The minutes simply read "Time Verification Protocol Updated," which looked small on paper and felt big in practice. People who were not there will say it was obvious from the start, and they will wonder why teams moved before verifying. People who were there remember the tone in that whisper, and the way good intentions sprint when wind hits the valley wrong. Rhea thinks the truth sits between those angles, and that winter rewards humility more than certainty, especially when phones and storms share a stage. She wrote that in the margin of her map, in handwriting that tilted uphill like a person leaning into a cold night. When she passed the Nightlark one afternoon with the window cracked, she heard the elevator clap echo through the empty corridor. It sounded like a period at the end of a long sentence that finally made sense, and she let the thought linger until the highway bent. The motel squatted back into its season of travelers who just need a warm bed and a snow-free path to the door. The voicemail lived on in a folder, and in the way the county listened to machines, and in the simple habit of checking the time. The stories. Why this abandoned cabin had alleged proof in drywall. The story kept circling a single point about an empty cabin and a word written behind drywall. People called it proof. They did not agree on what it proved, but they repeated the word until it sounded heavy. Renata Vale was 36 and worked as a county property assessor who handled delinquent parcels. She drove a faded sedan, kept a folder of index cards, and listened to dispatch traffic. On a late spring morning, she headed to a decommissioned fishing road where a tax sale cabin sat empty. Her goal was simple and boring, which was to document storm damage before the auction and verify the interior. The cabin stood near a shallow creek with boards turned gray and a porch sag bent toward the dirt. A rusted mailbox leaned near the gate, with paint scabbed off and a number grit filmed over. Renata took photos for the file. Then she checked the back door where a hasp hung, but the lock was missing. She logged the broken hardware as prior damage, then stepped inside while the floor pressed its complaint. The incident began as a sound that did not fit the room, and then a sight. A sheet of drywall in the front room had a patch that sounded hollow when tapped. The panel was bright white against tobacco walls, and 4 black screws sat too straight and clean. She noted a faint dust halo around the joint compound, which looked newer than the rest by many years. She started a routine sweep while recording voice notes to keep the chain of events tidy. The stove held a nest of brittle twigs, the fridge was gone, and a thin mattress lay folded. Renata kept moving and counted outlets, then paused at the patched panel again. Her notes said the sheet brand looked like a type common after 2010, not the 1980s era expected here. 2 neighbors drifted by while she worked and gave versions that agreed on mood, not detail. A ranch hand named Cleo Vargas recalled sirens and smoke from 1998 when a fire line whipped through. Cleo said a man who stayed here left in a hurry and never came back, and people held a fundraiser that winter. A grocer named Benito Lake remembered men in a county truck replacing a little window about 2012, though he admitted the year could be off. Renata took their names, then asked if anyone else checked the cabin in recent years. Cleo said an insurance adjuster came by after a windstorm, and Cleo believed the woman filed a report and sealed the door. Benito said a teenager broke in 2 summers later, then a deputy taped a notice and told kids to stay away. Renata wrote both recollections as witness statements with the usual caveats about memory. She returned to the panel and looked for a reason a patch would be that clean inside this neglected shell. The screws were square drive, which was common for newer fasteners, and the spacing suggested a single small repair. The joint compound had been sanded poorly and left a telltale crescent above the seam. She ran a small flashlight along the edge and found a hair-thin line that was not paint. Her job did not include prying open walls without cause, so she called her supervisor and explained the condition. He told her to capture more context and check permits, then hold off on any invasive step until the records search. Renata agreed and left the cabin to sit with her laptop in the car while the creek talked its small talk. The county database was a stubborn thing that offered results if you knew how to ask without being greedy. She entered the parcel number and found a series of tax liens followed by a default. The permit history showed 2 entries worth attention. First, a window replacement request filed 2011, then a drywall materials purchase noted by a grant program 2015. The second entry surprised her, since the grant was designed for weatherization, not interior repairs. She cross-checked the vendor list and saw a receipt from a hardware store 3 towns away. The purchase line item said half-sheet gypsum and screws, with a date in early summer 2015. A note mentioned a volunteer crew and a case number from the sheriff office. Renata paused and rechecked the address to make sure she was not mixing properties. She downloaded everything, then called the sheriff records clerk and asked if the case number could be viewed. The clerk said the report was open public information because it involved property maintenance hours completed after a welfare check. The description said a deputy supervised a group that boarded a back window and patched a hole where a wood stove pipe had been. The deputy name was listed as J. Kravitz, with a badge number and a contact line. Renata called the number and reached a retired deputy, who answered his phone with a dry voice and correct dates. He remembered standing in that cabin while a volunteer placed a sheet over a hole, and he remembered the neighbors bringing lemonade. He also remembered boys laughing because someone had drawn a cartoon in dust above the refrigerator space. Renata thanked him and asked if any record included interior photos from that day that could be released. Kravitz said he took 3, which he felt comfortable sharing if the clerk confirmed the release path. The email reached her 10 minutes later, with 3 small images showing a 2-clean patch, a bent stovepipe, and a blank wall. The timestamp read 2015, with an hour that matched late afternoon shadows. Renata zoomed in and saw the same screw pattern she had just seen in person. She returned inside with a copy of the email printed, which satisfied her need for a pre-image before touching anything. She recorded a video on her county phone, then gently ran a utility blade along the painted seam and loosened the small patch. The square drive screws turned with almost no resistance and dropped into her pocket. The board came free and showed the backside marked with pencil lines. There were 2 words in block print near the center, and a string of numbers that looked like miles or hours or both. The words read, "Tell Mara," then below them a date in words that matched late summer 2015. A thin arrow pointed toward the upper corner, where someone had tucked a sealed plastic bag with a micro SD card. Renata did not touch the bag, since she already had more than enough cause to stop and phone this in. She stepped back and spoke to her phone, as if it were a witness who needed comfort rather than patience. She said she had an evidentiary find, likely tied to a case report from 2015, and she described the board condition. She then called her supervisor and said she would hold position and request a deputy to document chain of custody. Her voice felt steady, which helped, and the creek still talked. The responding deputy arrived from the nearest substation and followed a familiar script at a deliberate pace. He photographed the panel, bagged the micro SD card, then requested a second unit to confirm signatures. He also asked Renata to repeat her steps for his body camera, which she did, and her voice stayed calm. He wrote "Tell Mara" in his notebook and underlined the date, then asked about any person by that name in the area. Cleo returned when he saw the cruiser and stood at the fence with a careful expression that suggested curiosity and worry. He said a woman named Mara used to work at the gas station near the highway, and she moved inland after the big fire. He believed she dated the man who once stayed at this cabin, whose name people rarely said anymore. Cleo said the man had a brother who fought with him over debt, which was rumor, and old rumor at that. Renata kept the witness statement straight and did not chase speculation, because theory makes friendly noise but muddies facts. The deputy asked dispatch to check archived calls around late summer 2015 for any mention of the station or the creek. Dispatch later replied that an incomplete emergency call pinged a tower near the old highway with a man's voice saying "wrong truck" before the line died. The call was never connected again, and the dispatch note listed a response that found nothing conclusive on the road. The investigators gathered all of this and began to lay a clean map of what the drywall might mean. The board was patched during a small volunteer day led by Deputy Kravitz, who remembered no note then because the drywall face was clean. The writing was on the backside, so whoever wrote "Tell Mara" likely wrote before installation or wrote during installation and then faced the board inward. The micro SD card fit the same logic, since it had to be tucked away before final screws. The sheriff tech opened the bag carefully and previewed the card on a laptop while Renata stood near the doorway. The card held a few small files and one audio clip that was less than a minute long, with a man breathing hard. A voice said "Mara." Then there was a scrape sound. Then the voice said, "Wrong truck? Check mile marker 12. Then silence. The text said the file metadata matched a late summer date, 2015, which matched the pencil note. The deputy asked Benito about mile 12, and Benito said a vanished reflector stood near a turnout everyone used for tire chains. He said the place was not on maps, but everyone knew it by a crooked pine and a faded mile stencil. A second unit drove there and found an old-cut bank with broken bottles and a rusted number plate choked by vines. That team then called for a grid walk and a metal sweep, which turned up a torn piece of a license frame. County records later produced an abandoned truck report filed by a salvage yard in early fall 2015. The report said a pickup had been moved by a private tow from a turnout before a storm and later sold for parts. The tow ticket listed a different mile marker by mistake, likely copied wrong by the driver, and the ticket names were hard to read. The salvage manager admitted their clerk sometimes took shortcuts with paperwork when storms crowded the yard. A detective interviewed the retired tow driver and asked for his memory of the pickup and its condition after the call. The driver said he remembered an empty truck with a broken rear glass and a tarp inside that smelled like gasoline. He said 2 men met him at the turnout and pointed to a path, and he signed a work order that he no longer had. He said he remembered a gold wedding band on a chain near the shifter, which he placed in a cup holder out of caution. The audio clip and the drywall note nudged the case from rumor to a timeline that had context and checkable waypoints. The incomplete call in 2015 used the words "wrong truck," which matched the audio and echoed through dispatch records. The mild repair day in 2015 created a perfect stage for a message that only a future visitor might find. The instruction "Tell Mara" suggested the writer knew a specific person would eventually hear about the cabin again. Renata learned that temp crews sometimes used whatever board they had in the truck, which could explain the face-inward mistake. A volunteer might have grabbed a sheet with a pencil note from the stack without thinking, then installed it with the note hidden. Another possibility was that the writer meant to hide the message, assuming a person who cared would eventually come prying. Both options fit the facts, and neither required creative leaps that could not be defended in a report. A second pass through the micro SD card revealed a photo of a dashboard with a gas station logo seen through the windshield. The date stamp matched the summer of 2015, and the triangle logo was the old brand used before a sale. Benito confirmed that the station repainted their canopy that autumn, which inadvertently confirmed the window of time. The detail felt small and almost petty, yet it anchored the sequence to a real week. The detective contacted the station owner, who produced archived night logs, showing a purchase by a prepaid card at 11:42. A print from the receipt showed a pack of ice and a cheap burner phone that matched the model seen in the photo. The clerk on duty had long since moved, though a manager remembered a man who returned twice that night to borrow tape. He said he thought the man looked scraped up, and he remembered a truck with a blue fender and a white tailgate. A family member of the man who stayed at the cabin identified the voice on the audio as a high likelihood match. They provided an older voicemail that had similar breathing patterns when the man climbed hills for fun on weekends. The sheriff's office sent both clips to a regional lab, which returned a cautious report that said the two voices were likely related. The lab kept the language safe, which made sense because certainty in audio work is often impossible. The drywall word itself caused arguments in corners where the story traveled faster than any memo could hope to move. People liked the part where the house was silent for years while a small message waited for a careful hand. Some said the word proof made sense because the voice was clearly him, and because the date matched the summer when he vanished. Others said proof is for courtrooms and journals, and this was only a lead until tested. Renata held her own view, which was that houses keep small time capsules without meaning to, and sometimes that matters. She had seen children's names carved into baseboards under carpet and grocery lists folded under a sink. She had also seen unsafe wiring stuffed into a cereal box and tucked inside a wall, and the box told its own story. People leave messages wherever they can, hoping someone decent will listen someday when it counts. The case shifted again when a trail crew found a piece of a phone shell near mile marker 11 during a separate survey. The shell matched the burner model bought that night, and nearby crews found a patch of old stain on the soil. A lab swab reported that the residue was fuel, which was consistent with the tow driver memory of gasoline smell in the truck. A chain of steps formed that linked the turnout, the audio clip, and the tow yard path. Mara was located by a social worker who knew 3 different last names for her from utility records. She met with investigators in a room that smelled like coffee, that had been reheated many times and left to think. She said she had not heard from him since that summer, and she cried in a way that was lightless but dry. When told about the drywall note, she put her head down and whispered that he tried to fix things and always left notes. She agreed to listen to the clip, then nodded and said the words were his when he felt cornered by debt and fear. She said wrong truck made sense because his brother drove a similar model and people mixed them up when angry. She said mile 12 meant the turnout where they used to watch road crews because he loved slow machines more than sleep. She asked if the word proof meant she could stop imagining him as a ghost in every passing pickup. The detective did not promise anything, which was the right call, and said the message mattered more than rumor. Mara said that was good enough for now and asked if she could visit the cabin to see the panel with her own eyes. Renata met her there with Cleo and Benito nearby, and they all stood quiet while the creek kept talking. Mara touched the pencil words like a fingertip prayer, then laughed once, small and sudden, because the handwriting was his. The county eventually sold the parcel to a quiet bidder who planned to reclaim lumber and leave the footprint for a garden. Before the sale, the sheriff's office returned the panel to the property with a sealed sleeve that covered the message. A small plaque nailed to a beam recorded the date in words and the name of the deputy who first supervised repairs. It did not use the word proof, which felt right, because the wall was more than a verdict. Reporters asked Renata if she believed the drywall solved anything that mattered, and she answered with careful honesty and patience. She said it solved whether the cabin hid a message, and it offered a direction for facts to continue breathing. She said the board changed a rumor cloud into a line of checkable points that connected people who had waited years. She also said that what you call proof depends on the room you are standing in and the weight on your heart. The story kept circulating, and people kept walking that turnout and counting the faded stencils with respect and quiet. They looked for signs that someone had tried to speak in a tight corner and had chosen an odd messenger. They bent close to drywall, then stepped back and saw a small room that finally felt less like a tomb. They understood that time can hide a message, and sometimes the wall just needs a steady hand and a simple blade. When Renata thinks about the cabin now, she remembers the hush when the board came free and the pencil marks appeared. She remembers Cleo and Benito telling careful pieces and retired Deputy Kravitz recalling lemonade in a little paper cup. She remembers that proof is a rough word for a gentle thing, which is a voice asking someone to tell a person named Mara. She believes the house did what houses sometimes do, which is hold a note until the right listener finally arrives. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The guard wrote down 8 distinct bouts of footsteps inside an empty building, and the cameras showed nothing all night. 2 separate motion sensors tripped near the same hallway, yet playback displayed a silent corridor with only the exit sign glow. His name was Barrett Lorme, 42, a night security officer at a regional logistics hub off a county road. The building sat between a rail spur and a belt of trees, and the company shipped auto parts and appliances. Barrett worked the 10 to 6 shift in a brown uniform that always smelled faintly of dust and coffee. He carried a flashlight, a radio, and a phone that hooked into a dispatch line, and he liked the quiet. He had a simple goal that Tuesday night in early spring, finish his rounds and sign off incident-free by dawn. He had brought a thermos of soup and a paperback, planning to spend the downtime in the small control room. He checked the weather and watched rain move in thin sheets across the lot lights. He thought about replacing his shoes, since the tread had started to squeal on polished tile. The incident started just after midnight, when he heard measured steps across the second-floor mezzanine. He was finishing a log entry about a storm alert, and the sound came clean and steady through the ceiling. He checked camera feeds for the mezzanine, but the screens showed still aisles and palleted boxes. He grabbed his light and his radio, and he headed for the stairs with the practiced calm of routine. At the mezzanine, he found that familiar quiet hum from the conveyors, a noise that never truly stopped. The footsteps repeated behind him, like someone matching his pace near the rail that overlooked receiving. He pivoted fast, saw only empty air and a red light blinking on a camera dome. He walked the length of the aisle while noting the time, and every time he paused, the steps seemed to pause. He logged the first occurrence at 12:15, wrote down the location, and continued his route. On the next pass, he heard them again near the battery storage closet, crisp against the concrete. He spoke into his radio, more for procedure than comfort, and announced that he was investigating a possible trespass. He found the closet locked and the seal unbroken, which did not help his nerves. From the control room, recordings later showed a hallway with nothing but reflected light pooling against steel doors. The microphones in that area were old and tinny, yet they caught a faint rhythm that matched walking. The time code on the feed read 12:18, which matched his scribbled note from the clipboard. He wrote a second entry because repeated anomalies meant paperwork, and paperwork meant patience. By 1:20, the steps had moved to the long corridor past the break room, and Barrett felt the hairs rise on his arms. He had switched to his backup flashlight after the primary started to flicker, which made the hallway feel longer. He called dispatch on the archived line and requested a patrol swing through the outer lot, which sounded more confident than he felt. The dispatcher logged it and told him to stay on channel, which he did while walking slow. Around 2, the rain intensified, and the roof drums sent soft rolls through the rafters that sounded like distant carts. Barrett tried to isolate the sound by standing still, counting under his breath, then moving again. The footsteps returned with the same cadence each time, never rushing, never trailing off, like a metronome following his heel. He marked the third and fourth occurrences, and the sheet started to look like a pattern. He started to reconstruct the history of the building in his head in that practical way that guards do when bored. The hub had been expanded twice, and the mezzanine had been added after the original slab settled. A retired manager once said the second floor carried sound, strangely because the joists had been spliced during a shutdown. That small detail stuck now because odd structure often equals odd sound, and odd sound confuses cameras. He decided on an internal check of maintenance records, so he dug into a filing cabinet near the back wall. He found a binder labeled Floor Vibration Studies, stamped with a date from 2009 and signed by an engineer. He skimmed line items and saw mention of a resonance under certain loads and a recommended brace that was never installed. He took a photo on his phone, more habit than plan, then heard the steps again behind the door. He opened the door fast and swung the light through dust and metal shelves, and nothing moved. He stepped inside, closed the door, and waited until the air felt heavier, then walked, which pulled the sound along like a shadow. He spoke low into his radio and said, "Test." And he heard a soft reply through the ceiling that sounded like his own voice. He marked the fifth occurrence, then circled the time twice because the echo trick felt wrong. Barrett called the shift supervisor at home, a man named Gilles, and left a calm message. He explained that sensors popped twice, cameras showed clear, but audio suggested movement that matched his pace. He asked permission to halt one conveyor and test the mezzanine with the motor silent, since noise masking can complicate readings. He set the phone down and sipped soup while rain hit the window like static. The lot patrol rolled in at 2:30, and a deputy named Ames checked doors with a bright light and gentle humor. Ames wore a jacket that looked older than the car, and he liked to tease Barrett about hobby detective work. He came inside, listened near the break room, and heard the steps when Barrett moved, then nodded like a man hearing an old song. He wrote a short note on a card and suggested they check the time sync on the cameras. Barrett pulled up the system configuration, and a small detail finally jumped out where he had not looked. The network video recorder had synced to a time source that shifted during a recent firmware update. The correct setting had moved to a secondary tab, and the cameras were drifting a minute and a half slow during overnight resets. He compared timestamps against the dispatch call log, and the mismatch explained one gap, but not all gaps. He pulled out old handheld footage from training drills, which he kept on a thumb drive for new hires. A clip from 2019 showed a tour up the same staircase on a quiet Sunday night. The trainer had mentioned that the mezzanine acted like a drum when a person moved near the expansion joint. In the background, steps mirrored the instructor in perfect time, and the camera, pointed into the void, recorded nothing but sound. Witness statements from shipping staff added another layer. Since people love to tell small tech stories when asked kindly, a forklift driver said the mezzanine cameras had been moved 2 years earlier after a near miss with a swinging hoist. The new angles covered the rails and aisles, but created a narrow dead zone where a parapet shadow swallowed detail. The guard had never noticed because no one had reported anything in that exact strip. At 3:15, Barrett and Ames did a careful test. Treating the building like a patient with a stubborn cough, Barrett walked 5 paces, paused, walked 5, paused, and Ames watched monitors and marked everything on a yellow pad. The audio track caught consistent taps that matched the shoes, and the video showed an empty frame right where the parapet shadow lived. The dead zone was only 3 feet wide, yet it covered the spot where the resonance amplified best. They tried the same thing with the conveyor powered down, and the pattern grew clearer and less masked. Without the motor hum, the sound felt sharper, as if the building had pulled back a curtain, yet the frame still looked clean. Ames snapped his fingers and said, "That right there is our ghost. If a ghost paid rent and liked stairs." Barrett smiled without meaning to, then told him he would still file the incident by the book. He went back to the maintenance binder and took a second photo of a page about a brace that was never installed. The engineer had recommended a crossmember at the joint to dampen a known frequency that matched walking strides. In one margin, someone had written a note about budget carryover that probably killed the fix with a shrug. He put that in his notes with a plain line that said, "Brace never added, resonance persists during light traffic." The sixth occurrence came while he wrote that sentence. Like the building wanted to underline the point, he recorded the time, then cross-checked it against the corrected system time on the recorder, and they finally aligned. He realized the worst part was not the sound, but the way uncertainty stretched time during long nights. He spoke aloud to the empty hallway and said, "That is enough now," which felt silly but oddly steadying. He kept investigating because good habits make future nights easier, which matters more than a single scare. He printed the camera layout and traced the dead zone with a highlighter, then labeled each motion sensor with its field of view. He checked battery dates because a dying sensor can behave like a jumpy cat, and both batteries were fresh from last month. He called the day supervisor and left a second message with a tighter summary. The seventh and eighth occurrences happened as a pair near 4, right when shift change trucks started rumbling past the fence line. The steps matched his route exactly. Yet the sound slid forward and backward based on where he stood near the rail. He pictured the mezzanine as a guitar body that needed a finger pressed lightly on a string to quiet a note. He thought about the brace again, and he made a final note that felt like an instruction. When Gilles called back just before 5, Barrett kept his tone normal and direct. Gilles asked if he needed an officer to sit inside until the sun came up, and Barrett said they were fine now. He explained the misaligned timestamps and the dead zone shadow and the resonance sheet that read like a forgotten to-do. Gilles sighed, then said to write it clean and attach the photos to the morning inbox. Barrett did that line by line, treating the log as a small map for the next person. He wrote that witnesses heard the sound during training in 2019 and that maintenance had never added the brace. He wrote that the camera angles needed a minor shift to close the dead zone near the parapet. He added that the network recorder needed a corrected time source to prevent drift during overnight resets. He included a note about the patrol deputy who observed the sound and saw clean frames. Because outside eyes help, he kept the language careful and dry, avoiding drama, sticking to facts he could show later without wobble. He attached phone photos of the binder pages, the highlighted camera layout, and his clipboard entries that matched the sensor alerts. He finished by recommending a temporary closure of the area until the brace could be installed. Sunrise cleaned the edges of everything, and the building felt ordinary again, which was a relief he did not say. The rain slowed, and a gull rode the wind over the rail spur, which made him laugh at himself for being jumpy. He locked the mezzanine door and placed a bright cone at the landing, because simple signals beat superstition every time. He poured the last of his soup into a paper cup and let the steam warm his nose. When the day shift filed in, Barrett handed the report to the receptionist and nodded to the warehouse lead. He told the lead to keep people off the mezzanine except for essential work, and the lead agreed with a tired salute. Ames waved from his car and drove off with the easy confidence of a man satisfied by a solvable problem. The place returned to its ordinary clatter, which was the best sound in the world that morning. In the weeks that followed, the company installed the missing brace and retuned the camera angles by a small degree. A contractor ran a new line to the time source, then logged the change and initialed the tab with a neat signature. The steps never reappeared in the same way, according to follow-up notes and archived calls from later shifts. Barrett replaced his shoes and kept working nights, because quiet had always been the goal. If anyone asked about the story, he told it straight, and he never padded the edges to make it spooky. He said that buildings remember their mistakes in the shape of their echoes, and a cheap fix can teach a loud lesson. He said that cameras can lie without malice if someone nudges their clocks or points them an inch left. He said that good logs can save an hour of fear, which felt true every time he wrote a line. By summer, the mezzanine felt like any other walkway. Not a drum, not a stage, not a mirror for footsteps. The report lived in a drawer with other small sagas of night work, each one patient and plain. Barrett liked that the truth did not need big words or legends, just careful notes and people who read them. He had found the sound and given it a reason, and the reason made the building quiet again.